Everyone, my name is Sofia Selli, and today I'm going to be presenting the paper DiStefano, Decentralized Infrastructure for Sharing Trusted Encrypted Facts and Nothing More. And this is joint work with Alex Davison, Hamed Haddadi, Gonzalo Pestana, and Joe Rowell. And if you're interested in the full version of the paper, I invite you to read it over the link that is in this slide. Okay, just to start, what we going to be talking about today is the design of a distributed and decentralized system. Essentially, what we want to do is to have the ability to commit to TLS 1.3 encrypted data so that we can prove statements over that specific data. And what we will want to prove is that indeed that statement follows the correct format for a language, prove over AES, GCM, or Chachapoly, which are the algorithms supported as encryption algorithms in TLS 1.3, proof set statements, and for that, we're going to be leveraging the usage of zero-knowledge proofs. In order to properly describe our system, maybe it is good to start with an example. So for example, let's say that you have a connection with a specific website, and that website indeed is, for example, one that belongs to a bank. And this bank indeed asks you to, for example, to provide a proof that you're over 18, because they ask for that specific proof. And the way that you provided that is by showing, for example, your identity document. And the response, if it is indeed a valid identity document from that specific bank and its specific connection, is a success from the server. And that is usually how it goes when you're actually proving, for example, that you're over 18. And what we want to do with this protocol is to actually have the ability to export that specific proof that you just generated with that bank website, so that later can be used for other websites. So when other websites ask you for that specific proof of your age, you no longer have to show your identity document or show any kind of private information, but you leverage the fact that you already generated this proof in the past with the past connection with that specific bank website in order to be able to access the services. So essentially what we're doing is kind of creating a credential, a zero-knowledge credential that you can later use in different other connections with other websites. So again, just to set the scenes, what we want is to be able to prove something. We don't want to prove that in the clear because that would be a privacy violation, but rather we want to leverage the usage of zero-knowledge proofs. And we also want to leverage the usage of TLS, the Transport Layer Security Protocol, because that's how we generate the majority of connections in the internet. So again, to give you the example, what we want to prove is, for example, that the field age exists in this specific JSON-based document that has been sent over TLS traffic. We want to prove that indeed this has been generated properly in a TLS 1.3 connection with a specific website and that it has been committed to. We want to demonstrate that it follows correctly the JSON syntax, that it follows, for example, the correct syntax for integers, and later also we want to prove that it's over 18. And in this paper, what we essentially did is the first one of this specific complex system. We give the ability to generate commitments over this specific transmitted data over TLS 1.3. So this is DiStefano. Okay, so how can we eventually do that? Is by, for example, by using these protocols that are usually called three-party handshake protocol or CK-TLS protocols. And in our paper, we decided to define them as designated commitment TLS protocols or DCTLS protocols. Essentially, what they are is that they are modified TLS handshake that allow commitment to statements over the TLS channel with a designated verifier. So essentially what we're going to be having is that we're going to be having this third party that secret shares information with the client so that this party can commit to the specific data that is sent over the TLS session. So later you can create zero-knowledge proofs over that specific commitments. And there exists already some examples of such systems, for example, DECO, TLS Notary, Tankrai, Gabaldon Proof, and Janus. But we will find out when we're actually doing some review of the literature is that those previous works have some limitations. So for instance, for example, they don't have explicit or detailed support for TLS 1.3, and as we will see later, it is non-trivial to actually migrate a protocol from TLS 1.2 to TLS 1.3. They also lack a formal security analysis, have efficiency concerns, provide also some no client privacy, and also don't have an open source implementation. So we wanted to solve all of these limitations with the protocol I'm presenting, which is DiStefano. Okay, so what are designated DCTLS protocol? Essentially, those are protocols that will allow you to generate commitments to a specific data that is transmitted over TLS. And they usually have two phases, a handshake, a query, and a commit phase. And these phases happen in parallel. So just to remind you how TLS 1.3 works, this is a protocol that has essentially two phases, a handshake layer and a record layer. The handshake layer is essentially this layer in which you generate keys that are going to be used to encrypt and decrypt messages, at the record layer, which is when you actually send data over the TLS 1.3 session. The handshake layer also allows you to authenticate with the server, meaning that the client is assured that they are talking with the correct server. This version of the protocol is the one that provides the strongest security properties and also has the majority of the handshake messages encrypted. So how can we do to actually migrate TLS 1.3 to integrate this third-party verifier to create a DCTLS protocol? What we do is that we secret share all of the session keys between the client and the verifier, such that the verifier never has a complete view of those specific keys that are used to encrypt and decrypt messages, and that they are able to commit to that specific data. So they are able to commit to messages sent in the handshake layer and also at the record layer. So later we can create a commit and proof mechanism. And as I told you, they essentially have three phases. So let's start looking at the first one. On the first one, you essentially have also different subphases, but essentially the core of the idea is that you will secret share the session keys between the client and the verifier. So what the client and the verifier essentially withhold at different times is additive shares of that specific key material. And all of the operations that are used in order to derive the keys that are going to be used to encrypt messages of the handshake or to encrypt messages at the record layer are going to be produced in a secret share form, so as the one that you see in this specific diagram. But the client will have the ability to encrypt and decrypt the messages because eventually the verifier at certain points of the handshake is going to be revealing their share so that the client can essentially decrypt the messages. And as I told you, one of the core ideas of the handshake phase is also to provide authentication that the client is indeed talking with the correct server. Of course, we also want to provide this reassurance with that specific verifier that we are integrated into the handshake, but we cannot just directly forward those specific messages to the verifier because that will be a privacy violation and we will be revealing the browser history of that specific user over time. So what we also decided to create is essentially a ring signature zero knowledge proof that essentially allows the ability for the client to generate a zero knowledge proof that attests that the client is talking to the correct server in relationship to a set of publicly known servers. And if you want to know about a zero knowledge proof, I invite you to see our follow-up work that is highlighted in this slide. Okay, so essentially now we have a way that we can indeed secret share the specific session keys of the specific handshake. And as I told you, this is done so that the verifier never has a complete view of the keys. But essentially as a client, what happens now is that you receive those messages from the server, and what you do is that you forward them to the verifier, so they are kind of like committed by the verifier. But it turns out when you're specifically using the cipher suites that are supported by TLS 1.3, so for instance, AES GCM in an AEAD setting, it turns out that those specific ciphertexts are not really committing, because it turns out that there's a really easy key committing attack that you can launch against that specific algorithm. So for a different message and a different key, for instance, the client can find the same ciphertext, which means that again, we're not really making the verifier be committed to that data. So what we did in DiStefano is that we modify AES GCM so we can always provide a commitment both to that specific message and also to the keys that are used in that specific encryption algorithm, so that the client cannot launch this specific key committing attack. So essentially what we have now is that we have a way to secret share the session keys data. We have a way to forward and receive messages from the server by the client to the verifier so that they are committed to. And essentially once they are committed, the verifier can reveal their share of that specific session key so that the client can decrypt those messages, which essentially provides you an ability to commit to that and also for the client to be able to fully decrypt the messages that are sent during the TLS handshake. Okay, and we did that. We generate these commitments and we modify the handshake in this way. And we have an implementation in C++ that is integrated in BoringSSL. And it's around 14K lines of code. And we also perform some measurements and we locally evaluated them both in a LAN and also non-locally in a WAN setting. And what we found out is that we arrived to a handshake that is less than a second, which is great because it is still in the time frame of the handshake timeout times that are usually provided in TLS 1.3 implementations. And we also have less or equal of 80 KEB to send during the online phase, which again is great from a network perspective. Okay, and as I told you, essentially what we have here in this protocol is a handshake phase, query phase, and commitment phase that happens in parallel because as I explained, you also have to commit to those specific messages. And you also have a query phase because during the record layer phase, essentially what you do is that you query for a specific data that you know exists in that specific server, and the server replies to them. And in the record layer phase, just as I have explained in the handshake layer phase, what you do is that you receive these messages from the server, you commit to them to the verifier. Once the verifier has committed to them, then the verifier reveals the share of the key, and only then the client can indeed decrypt those specific messages. And because we have committed those specific messages with the verifier, it means that now we can generate proofs over that specific data. So coming back to the beginning, when we said that, for example, we want to prove that a specific field age that is over 18 exists in the specific data, what it means now is that we have a commitment to that data that has that specific information. And now we can create these zero-knowledge proofs that attest that indeed this data is well formed in regards, for example, to the JSON context-free grammar, that indeed the specific field exists at the top of the document, and that indeed that the value associated with the field is indeed a proper integer, and it's also over 18. So that will mean the creation of zero-knowledge proofs. And that's indeed some future work that we're currently undertaking on how to properly create these zero-knowledge proofs when thinking about the specific format of this data, and also to the fact that they are encrypted in an AEID setting. So just to bring home, what we have done essentially in this work is to have this protocol that we call DiStefano, which just gives you the ability to create commitments to AES GCM encrypted data that is transmitted over TLS 1.3. And with that, I'll thank you very much and open the floor for questions. And you want to read the full version of the paper, again, here is the link with the link to the full version. And you want to play with the code that is written in C++, I have also added a link to the open source implementation that we have. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. And questions? Any questions? So maybe I'll begin with a short question. So in the paper, you did not present in your presentation, obviously, for lack of time, but you have some optimizations which you have done to improve performance. In fact, you didn't also kind of show performance results. Maybe you want to talk about your performance and the optimizations a bit, just a bit?
We indeed have some optimizations because one of the things that I did talk a little bit in the presentation is that we had to modify AES. So we also had to modify it so that we don't incur in like more time. So we have to find an algorithm that will not be so slow. So that will be like kind of like the first optimization, but in regards to modify algorithm. But what we also did is that we modified some of the pre-sharing of these specific additive shares that you have to generate. So if you're familiar, for example, with playing with MPC protocols, you will know that it is not so easy to actually have MPC protocols that are very nicely performant. So what we did is that we modify heavily the pre-processing phase, so we can leverage a pre-processing phase to do the majority of the pre-computation. And once we launch the handshake, then no longer we will have a bottleneck in the MPC computations. So mostly it's around that. And the other thing that I highlighted a little bit in the talk is that you will see that we will have in this handshake, we have this pre-processing phase, meaning that you can generate all of these key shares, but in a secret share form in advance. So when you actually send the client hello, you no longer have to compute these shares because you have computed them ahead of time, and then you just initiate the handshake almost as usual in TLS 1.3. Hopefully that answers a little bit.
Just a general question. So we may know that TLS was deliberately designed to not require client authentication, so not required to even ask client to send any zero-knowledge proof. So what is your motivation of doing that, of verifying clients anyway?
Yes, so maybe it wasn't completely clear in the presentation. So we're not requesting for client authentication, but rather what we're having is the regular server authentication. So essentially in this protocol, you also send the server certificate message and the server certificate verify. But what you have to do is that you as a client, now you're assured that you're talking to that specific server, but you have to kind of like share that assurance with this third-party verifier. If you indeed share that assurance on the clear with this third-party verifier, meaning that you are just like forwarding the server certificate message to the verifier, you will be incurring in a privacy violation because you're literally showing the identity of the server and eventually disclosing the client browser history over time to this third party. So what we didn't want is just to forward this message to the verifier, so the verifier is also assured that the client is talking to the correct server, but rather creates these zero-knowledge proofs that shows to the verifier, this client is talking to a correct server, but I don't know exactly which server. Eventually, you could also expand the protocol to also allow for client authentication, but as I just said, that's an optional a step of the TLS 1.3 handshake, so we didn't put it as a mandatory thing.
I think we're done, so yeah, I'm sorry, there's, of course, more questions. Maybe they can ask you offline, although you're not here, but email probably and so on, right? Yeah, so let's thank all the speakers of this session, and thank you.